And away we go. So today's sermon is going to be on the history of the LGBTQ rights movement. Not to say that that movement is history, but to say that there is a lot of powerful history that we can be inspired by together. So let me just look at my notes. If I'm not looking directly into the camera the whole time, it's because I feel nervous when I lead a history class. That's not my usual forte. And so I might be reading directly from my notes the whole time, like some of those other ministers that you may have seen in the past. So we'll see what we can do. I'll try to be as charismatic as possible, but we'll see what we can do. Okay, so here we are. Where are we today? As you may know, just a Monday ago, so 6 days ago, the Supreme Court ruled, let me check my notes here again. Until Monday's decision, it was legal in more than half the states to fire workers for being gay, bisexual, or transgender. The vastly consequential decision thus extended workplace protections to millions of people across the nation, continuing a series of Supreme Court victories for gay rights, even after the president transformed the court with his 2 appointments. Yay! So monumental victory. Monumental victory. I mean, it seems like that victory should have happened, I don't know, 1,000 years ago, but we can still celebrate today the momentousness of it. At the same time, one of the reasons why this victory was so necessary was back in the end of March, I believe it was, an executive order came out that hobbled several of Obama's previous orders, including the Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces order, by revoking the requirement that companies seeking federal contracts prove they've complied with federal laws banning discrimination based on sexual identity or orientation. So to me, these are no-brainers, right? Why would you reverse a law that said you can't discriminate on people based on their gender identity or sexual orientation? So at the same time, when we are rapidly approaching the Star Trek universe we all know is possible, Jonathan Frakes told me about it on a Facebook video this morning about Gene Roddenberry's vision for the universe and why that means Black Lives Matter. At the same time that happens, we're also constantly struggling not to fall back into caveman days. And so it's important for us to keep this struggle in mind so that we can move the needle forward. Similarly, the monumental win in 2015 was finally a Supreme Court decision on marriage equality. And at the same time, the Republican National Convention has renewed their commitment to a platform that says marriage equality should not be a thing. So we're in an interesting moment in history. Okay, and then just a little note on social location. I want to let you know that I am fully aware that as a cis-het person, I'm maybe not the best person to talk about my understanding of the history of the struggle of LGBTQ people. It's not a struggle that I have had to participate in personally. I have chosen to try to be the best ally I can, more in recent years than before. But I want to let you know that I'm attempting to bring a lot of humility to giving this talk, because while I might not be the best person to give this talk, I think there's no better talk for this person to give. So I think that it's very important for those of us who have, what do you call it? Not a pulpit, a lectern. Those of us who have a lectern, even while physically not present, we should use that lectern for the highest possible ends. Okay, so that's just a little bit on social location. Knowing our social location, really important if we want to be good allies and activists. Another principle of activism we talked about last week is knowing the cultural moment. So we're in a cultural moment where many of us are aiming our voices and our energy toward the movement for Black lives. And it's also Pride Month. And so it's tricky, I think, not to get in a habit of trying to like, okay, can we check off all the boxes of making sure we're taking care of all of the oppressed communities in the United States, which is just a somewhat heartbreaking thing to have to say. We want to make sure that we can use our political power as people in the most powerful way possible. And so I'm really inspired by many of the leaders in the Pride movement deciding that this month's Pride would be in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. And I'd love to read you a letter that I found 100 or more Pride leaders have co-signed this letter that I found on the Human Rights Campaign website. And I'd love to read this to you as the opening of our sermon today. Titled, LGBTQ Organizations Unite to Combat Racial Violence. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. These words, written over 30 years ago by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, remind us that indifference can never bridge the divide of hate. And today, they should serve as a call to action to all of us and to the movement for LGBTQ equality. This spring has been a stark and stinging reminder that racism and its strategic objective, white supremacy, is as defining a characteristic of the American experience as those ideals upon which we claim to hold our democracy, justice, equality, and liberty. We listened to the haunting pleas of George Floyd for the most basic of human needs, simply breath, as a Minneapolis police officer kneeled with cruel indifference on his neck. We felt the pain of Breonna Taylor's boyfriend as he called 911 after plainclothes Louisville police kicked down the door of their home and shot her 8 times as she slept in her bed. We watched the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery by white vigilantes in Brunswick, Georgia, aware that they evaded the consequences of their actions until the video surfaced and sparked national outrage. We saw the weaponizing of race by a white woman who pantomimed fear in calling the police on Christian Cooper, a Black gay man birdwatching in Central Park. We have heard and read about the killings of transgender people, Black transgender women in particular, with such regularity it is no exaggeration to describe it as an epidemic of violence. This year alone, we have lost at least 12 members of our community: Dustin Parker, Neolisa Luciano Ruiz, Yampi Mendez Arocho, Monica Diamond, Lexi, Joanna Metzger, Serena Angelique Velasquez Ramos, Leila Pelaya Sanchez, Penelope Diaz Ramirez, Nina Pop, Haley J. O'Regan, and Tony McDade. All of these incidents are stark reminders of why we must speak out when hate, violence, and systemic racism claim too often with impunity Black lives. The LGBTQ movement's work has earned significant victories in expanding the civil rights of LGBTQ people. But what good are civil rights without the freedom to enjoy them? Many of our organizations have made progress in adopting intersectionality as a core value and have committed to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. But this moment requires that we go further, that we make explicit commitments to embrace anti-racism and end white supremacy, not as necessary corollaries to our mission, but as integral to the objective of full equality for LGBTQ people. We, the undersigned, recognize that we cannot remain neutral, nor will awareness substitute for action. The LGBTQ community knows about the work of resisting police brutality and violence. We celebrate June as Pride Month because it commemorates, in part, our resisting police harassment and brutality at Stonewall in New York City and earlier in California, when such violence was common and expected. We remember it as a breakthrough moment when we refused to accept humiliation and fear as the price for living fully, freely, and authentically. We understand what it means to rise up and push back against a culture that tells us we are less than, that our lives don't matter. Today, we join together again to say, Black Lives Matter, and commit ourselves to the action those words require. So I'll put the link to that in your chat box, just in case you would like to look up this open letter on your own. Really beautiful thoughts and feelings that I think many of us can share. So let's start a little bit with this word that we hear in there, anti-racism. This is a Pride and an LGBTQ rights talk today. But in this letter, this term anti-racism that I think you may have heard going around lately, but I'm not sure, unless you've been deeply reading up on it as rapidly as you can, that this term actually quite makes all the sense that it could. So I have been feverishly studying all that I can, particularly in this last week. And I particularly liked the book that's for our summer reading program, which is Stamped, which is the remix from Jason Reynolds of Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. And in this book, he talks a lot about anti-racism. So in the introduction, Kendi presents some clarity about what we mean by anti-racism, saying, a racist idea is any idea that suggests something is wrong or right, superior or inferior, better or worse about a racial group. An anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests that racial groups are equals. So you have, there it is, just as stark as you can make it, equality versus race essentialism, higher or lower, better or worse, based on the type of person that you are. Later on in other sources, Kendi goes on to describe how the goal of anti-racism is what we in the UU communities might actually call anti-oppression, because it would include any of the isms that we run into. If we truly want to embrace this ideal of what's being called anti-racism, we have to embrace anti-sexism, we have to embrace anti-homophobia, we have to embrace anti-transphobia. So I think we are going to need a new word, and at the same time, we also need to point out the word of the cultural moment where we can generate a little bit of consciousness, hopefully a lot of consciousness, where the culture at large has the movement to recognize that we still live in a culture mired in racism. And so the work of anti-racism is necessary. It struck me as I studied the timeline of the milestones in the LGBTQ rights movement, how three categories that Ibram Kendi presents are represented again in this movement. He calls these three categories segregationists, assimilationists, and anti-racists. So segregationists are those that believe we're so different we should be separate, either separate but equal, or separate and one is superior and one is inferior, or yeah, that's pretty much what you get. Assimilationists, on the other hand, are folks who believe that, well, we should have equality for the gay community so long as they look like the cis-het community. So we should have equality for the Black community so long as they look like, they do what Bill Cosby told us, and they make culture look more like the white community that's trying so hard to accept you. If you would just clean up your act a little bit and look more like the culture at large. This is an assimilationist view. And an anti-racist view, or what we might call an anti-oppression view, is one that wants to welcome not just tolerance, but welcome approval and acceptance of the beauty of our diversity. Okay, so we might need a new name. Anti-sexism and anti-homophobia and anti-transphobia must somehow be included. In UU studies, sometimes it's called anti-oppression, but we often need specificity in our naming to truly catalyze awareness of current harm. Right now, the cultural moment calls on us to do the work of anti-racists, but what we must remember that it's a bigger work. Racism is one of the symptoms of a more pervasive problem. And then, my UU friends, I think we're also allowed to dream of the day when we no longer need an anti-term. Right now is not that day. Like when you're sick, you don't just take biotics, you sometimes have to take antibiotics. And we are a society with illnesses that need to be treated. But I imagine that one day, when the specter of institutional and overt discrimination is so long gone, we can speak in terms of what we are for, rather than merely the illness that needs redress. These days are sadly not yet those days. We must continue to use the clunky vehicle of language to point out where our humanity is incomplete, where our human care is yet immature, and where we fail to rise to the threshold of integrity that we claim is ours. Senator Tammy Baldwin says, "There will not be a magic day when we wake up and it's now okay to express ourselves publicly. We make that day by doing things publicly until it's simply the way things are." Marsha P. Johnson again says, "As long as my people don't have their rights across America, there is no reason for celebration." The essence of anti-racism or anti-oppression is one of reinvoking the shared humanity that lies between us all. We don't do this by flattening everyone out to some arbitrary standard. We do it by celebrating our diversity, relishing our differences, and allowing that to help us recognize the inherent worth and dignity that makes us all the same at the core. All right, that's the intro. I'm trying to go quick. I was like, oh yeah, we'll just do a short sermon on the history of the LGBTQ rights move. Oh man. So it's highly truncated. I hope you don't mind, but we're gonna name drop, and just get the wheels turning and hopefully open our hearts together a little bit. Here we go, moving on. There is a meme going around. I don't know if you've seen it, if you're on this thing they call the internet, this newfangled thing. And I've seen this meme I think it's like a person like face palming themselves. And it says something like, "I just don't know how you teach a person that compassion is a good thing. I just don't know." And have you felt this way? I'm on gallery view, so I can see your little faces. Have you felt this way of like, how in the world do you take folks who seem that like they don't understand that compassion is important and teach them that empathy, compassion, like the worth of another human being is actually an important thing? Well, there's good news is that there's actually quite a bit of research about how you teach compassion, how you teach empathy. Usually it seems to be about resolving repressed or complex trauma. But that's a different sermon. I don't have time to tell you about that today. The other good news is that one of the ways that the LGBTQ rights movement has done it is through persistence. Through persistence. So this is a community of self-liberators who have worked to radically rehumanize themselves, and in so doing, help begin restoring humanity to the rest of us. The celebration is called Pride because the LGBTQ plus community has continually learned to rehumanize themselves in the face of widespread cultural opposition, and to teach others to rehumanize them as well. Not to be ashamed and meek, trying to hide or fit in, but to be proud of who one is. So this has not been, at least in recent years, an assimilationist struggle. This has been a profoundly anti-oppressive, anti-anything-ist struggle. And through persistence, it's made vast strides. Okay, LGBTQ rights has been an uphill battle with the decks stacked against the community. Hirschman, who wrote a great book called Victory, refers to the four horsemen working against the LGBTQ community. And so she points out that perhaps the LGBTQ rights movement has made greater strides than any other civil rights movement because of having to start so far behind. So the four horsemen that Hirschman points out were considered crazy, subversive, and disloyal by virtue of being gay or lesbian. So mental illness, first stigma. Their very act of sexual congress was criminal in all the states of the Union. So illegality. So I'm trying to count the four here. I took the quote directly. And they were considered sinful by the church. Okay, so, mentally ill, subversive, illegal, and sinful. Mentally ill, subversive, illegal, and sinful. And so when you start from that place, it's like a miracle that social justice activism can even get the ball rolling. So there's something really to be super proud of and super impressed by, that even at the beginning when we said, yay, we're finally got a Supreme Court decision that like gives our country some degree of humanity. When you look like that, it's disheartening that it's taken so long, and it's inspiring that the power of these activists to move against that much cultural inertia is like, that takes an intense amount of heart. And I hope that we together can be inspired by that degree of heartfulness. Okay, today we're going to look at just a few milestones in the history of American LGBTQ activism. It starts in the 1900s, when there wasn't so much yet any organized LGBTQ activism. But at this point, there was the beginning of gay community. So this was an underground community. You know the Four Horsemen, so this was not an above ground community. And yet the beginning of social clubs, of informal meetups started to weave together a community of people in the cities of this new country called America. During the Prohibition, because alcohol was illegal and everyone was drinking in underground environments anyway, it was actually easier to create, at this time, a gay or lesbian club scene because all the drinking was illegal at the time. Sadly, after the Prohibition, the law said that your bars must be orderly, and it was written into the law that to be a homosexual was considered disorderly. So America, post-Prohibition, had a law against drinking while gay. Still, there wasn't yet much organization until the 1950s. Here's your famous name drop. A person named Harry Hay founded this thing called the Mattachine Order. And the reason why Hay was so influential is because he had been trained by communists. So he was part of the Communist Party in America, and he snagged all of their technology for how to get a movement started, and he used it to start a movement for gay rights. A quote from Harry Hay, who says, "I can also say to the hetero world, well, thank you very much. I've learned a lot of how to organize and how to reach people. You have taught me what it means to live as an outlaw in your society legally, when I had been an outlaw sexually all my life anyway." Around the same time, the Daughters of Bilitis was formed as a lesbian rights group not long after the Mattachine was begun. Another amazing timeline. So the cool thing about the Mattachines and the Daughters of Bilitis is that this was the first time when people started hiring lawyers. So you've all heard of racial profiling, I'm sure. Well, back in the day, there was sexual orientation profiling, where the cops in New York would follow people around who they thought were gay. And then if they struck up a conversation with another guy, they could arrest them and take them in for disorderly conduct. And so in this era was the first time when people started to lawyer up and actually combat this discrimination. Okay, another little timeline marker, a name you should know is Bayard Rustin. So if you know about the famous speeches of Martin Luther King, you'll often see him off on the side of the stage. And in 1963, before I believe it was the March on Washington, Strom Thurmond goes to Congress and outs him and says, look, not only is all of this black uprising dangerous, but they've got a gay guy as well in a leadership position. We've got to shut this down. And that wasn't all that surprising that someone would do that. But what was surprising is that for the first time, the NAACP came out and backed up Bayard Rustin in a precedental moment. So 1963, when you're looking at the timeline, it's taking this from the gay movement, that's their own community, a segregated community. So even if they, some of the language at this time was, even if we're going to give them rights, they should be private. We know that it should be, not disrupt the rest of our cute little hetero world where we like to pretend that's not a thing. And you start to see people publicly coming out for the humanity of their LGBTQ siblings. Okay, Then, of course, in 1969, the most famous is the Stonewall riot. Stonewall, in case you didn't know, was a mafia-run club because you weren't allowed to have a gay bar. Still, this was considered the crime. Remember, the crime of drinking while gay. So LGBTQ people had to go to clubs that were run by the mafia, who would pay off the police, and they weren't quite a bar. And so it's actually the fact that they paid off the police was why they didn't listen to the warning that said there's a big raid coming down. The bouncers didn't trouble anyone, because normally they would try to shoo people out. But they thought they had paid up all their bribes. The police would come in, do their ordinary little thing, and then everything would settle down. Edmund White in the Stonewall Reader says, "A mafia-owned bar with police protection is an unlikely staging ground for liberation." So usually what would happen is that there were a few arrests. The police would come in. It was like sort of just a standard drill. They would check people's IDs. They would steal all the booze. They'd take a few members of the LGBT community, put them in the cars, take them downtown, etc. And they had a terrible, terrible practice of, if you were dressed as a woman, they would make you go to the bathroom so that they could check to see if your reproductive organs matched the gender of your clothing. Most of the time, in order to get things over with quickly, people would just say, "No, I'm cross-dressing tonight," so that they would not have to go through the indignity of this. Nobody quite knows exactly why it was a powder keg that night, but that night someone decided that enough was enough, and there was a riot. So you can read all about the Stonewall riot. We don't have time we could say a lot about it. But as a stroke of luck for the protesters, the police radio broke down. And this was why they ended up barricaded in the bar until they could send a runner out through the roof to the fire department to go and get help. So really quite wild. Stonewall wasn't the first act of resistance to violent and discriminatory policing, but it's the first one that was celebrated by an anniversary parade. And one of the things that's interesting about this is it's a mark of political savvy. It's actually knowing the hearts of people and knowing the cultural moment that said, if we commemorate this, this becomes a point of pride and solidarity. And according to most historians, this type of solidarity is something that the LGBTQ community was not able to gather until Stonewall. Something about that moment in history and the parade that commemorated it catalyzed the solidarity that was lacking up until that point in the community. J. London Toole, who was there, wrote, "Those that were arrested did not make that riot, did not make that rebellion, did not make that uproar. It was every expletive person that showed up in the thousands that made it. It was everybody as a community coming together and saying, that's enough. I'd seen every shade, every color, every body image there that night. It was all of us together, you know, and don't let any history book tell you different." Again, from Edmund White, "I just want to finish with one observation. Because of the Stonewall uprising, people saw homosexuals no longer as criminals or sinners or mentally ill, but as something like members of a minority group. It was an oceanic change in thinking." So we can start to see in my highly, highly truncated and abbreviated and fast-forwarded footnotes of history, how there's a movement of brave, brave individuals bringing themselves forward so that we who are not part of that struggle could have the opportunity to rehumanize them in our own eyes. So these were folks who had been given the 4 horsemen by society, who rehumanized themselves in acts of great strength and courage, and then came forward to allow the culture at large the chance to rise up to our own inherent worth and dignity and see our fellow humans as humans. A couple more footnotes of history. The Mattachine Society was still around, but had lost some of its revolutionary zeal. Some of those members say it got bogged down in bureaucracy, as many political and social change movements do. Soon after, splinters came off and they formed the GLF, the Gay Liberation Army, which didn't last very long, but that helped to create the Gay Activists Alliance, who organized a type of protest called ZAPs, as in like in a kid's game, I guess some kids in New York, I read this in a book, would go like, zap, you're dead. But they were going, zap, you're alive, to try to wake people up. So a couple of these fun zaps, one that they would do is they would get together and steal the microphone at big events, especially for the mayor, who had brought out a large degree of the LGBTQ liberal vote, yet was still doing nothing against discriminatory policing practices. So they would go to his events and then they would make a scene so that no one could ignore the fact that they were being discriminated against and dehumanized. I forgot to put the name of this quote. I'll get that to you later. One of the organizers of these zaps says, the idea was that these were like little theatrical productions. The other side came across as looking really oafish, stupid, and boring. And people on our side were exciting and wonderful and theatrical and inspiring and sexy and energetic. The Gay Activist Alliance also first framed their rights. They wrote their own sort of Declaration of Independence, and they framed the rights not in terms of tolerance, but of approval. They would show up at high-class events and cause a scene, not with the intention of violence, but to show that if members of the LGBT community could not have a social dance or drink in peace, then neither could anyone else. Another famous zap was in 1971, where they broke up the American Psychology Association meeting through a very famous zap. They got the microphone, and of course, the APA immediately ended the meeting and unplugged the microphone. Okay, last one, another milestone just in my abbreviated history was in the AIDS crisis. So AIDS, as you may remember if you were around in the Reagan era, was propagandized as a gay disease. AIDS was propagandized as a gay disease, and sadly, in another sad chapter of our American history, this was a reason why we did not rally the troops quickly to start to meet this crisis head on. We sort of just let it play its course against the sinners in the world. I'm not exactly sure how the propagandists spun it at the time. So growing out of a group called the Gay Men's Health Crisis came ACT UP. ACT UP utilized political activism to force the public to see the human face of the HIV positive. And while not limited to the LGBTQ community, their activism made great strides towards forcing people to open their hearts and understand the humanity of the LGBTQ community and beyond, even into the hetero community as well. A couple of little notes on their activism. This is from the book, This is an Uprising. In the following years, members of ACT UP returned to Wall Street and an unprecedented coup successfully shut down trading on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. They chained themselves inside pharmaceutical corporations and blockaded offices at the FDA, plastering posters with bloody handprints to the outside of the agency's headquarters. They stopped traffic on the Golden Gate Bridge and interrupted Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Using fake IDs to enter CBS headquarters, they jumped on screen during Dan Rather's nightly news broadcast, reeling off a string of chants before the network cut to a long, unplanned commercial break. So these are nonviolent, highly disruptive efforts to zap people awake, to show that you've dehumanized someone who is a human being. Finally, marriage. Again, from This is an Uprising. The Supreme Court's 2013 decisions on same-sex marriage, which struck down both California's ban and the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, were critical milestones, paving the way for the final 2015 ruling. But they were preceded by a long series of state-level legislative and legal fights. These included early legal wins in Hawaii in 1993 and Vermont in 1999, as well as the establishment of marriage equality in Massachusetts starting in 2003. They also included acts of civil disobedience, such as San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom's 2004 decision to marry same-sex couples in defiance of California state law. And they encompassed critical later developments such as the spread of same-sex marriage to New Hampshire, Connecticut, Iowa, and Washington, D.C. by 2010. Viewed incrementally, many of these early efforts were failures. The initial progress in Hawaii and Vermont, for example, was reversed, at least temporarily, by state legislation, and the winds that did hold prompted backlash in other places. Yet their symbolic value was immense. Although early legal challenges and legislative drives did not amount to much in terms of transactional gains, the impact of such initial advocacy could be charted through the steady movement in the polls. Wrapping up. We're in a little overtime, but it's history class and you just have to deal with it. We're not going to ring the bell until class is over. We can take from this study, our truncated abbreviated history, that perhaps the moral arc is long, but it does bend toward justice. In an era of frustration, when we use that quote, the takeaway shouldn't be calm down and be patient, but rather take heart, for we never know when we'll reach critical mass. The actions of the past that seem to be failures may have been laying the seeds of success. In the LGBTQ rights movement, the work has been one of anti-oppression, and this has been done by brave souls willing to put their lives on the line to show their humanity to those who would otherwise not see it. So what should this lead us to do? Well, to my friends in the LGBTQ community, you just keep doing you. And to my straight and cis friends, we are called to be the best allies we can be. I think that starts with education. Understand the struggles of LGBTQ plus people and the history. Then we can be empowered to activism with a bit more perspective, not judging a movement through a cishet lens, but humbly attempting to understand that there are points of view we may never fully understand. Yet in trying, we demonstrate our humanity to each other. This theme of anti-racism, anti-oppression is one of it reinvoking the shared humanity that lies between us all. We don't do this by flattening everyone out to some arbitrary standard. We do it by celebrating our diversity, relishing our differences, and allowing that to help us recognize the inherent worth and dignity that makes us all the same at the core. I'll finish with a quote from George Takei, and then if Dave didn't have to go because I went overtime, we'll finish with a song. George says, "We should indeed keep calm in the face of difference and live our lives in a state of inclusion and wonder at the diversity of humanity."